Act 4. Thump, thump, thump. As the 5 men approached the mouth of the valley, the ferocity of the drumming echoed throughout the endless mounds. The roaring of the drums bounced off the granite and bombarded the eardrums of the 5 men. As the beat of the drums grew closer, the men became increasingly rambunctious. "How far?" Abdul-Ahad asked while refreshing some of his variegated bandages. Ahmed sighed and said, "They are just over the mound. I'd say less than a mile." "Good. I was starting to get bored," Kassar said while gently patting his camel on the nose. The camel instinctively squirmed as the large hand mildly clobbered the nose of the camel. The men fulminated with laughter at their companion's unbashful bravado. "Kassar, make sure to leave some for the rest of us," Nasser said while readying his armaments. Thump, thump, thump. "There will be plenty of Sassanians for us to slay. For this I promise you, men. Ready your arms," Ahmed shouted to his squadron. Abdul-Ahad constricted his blacksmith hammer as hard as a python latching onto a gazelle. The salty air of the valley marinated his lips. The sun radiated from directly over the hilltop. Sweat lethargically dripped down his face. Large yellow circles formed under his armpits, like the rows of rings on a tree trunk. Crows flew over the hilltop, making a large concentric meridian, teeming with excitement and anticipating the feast to come. Thump, thump, thump. Kassar detached his war club from the camel and began to swing it in elongated concentric circles around his head. Nasser pulled back 2 of his 11 wavy Chris daggers. Abdul-Ahad clasped onto his blacksmith hammer. Ahmed Fahad unsheathed his curvy sword. Asad pulled back his bow and arrow. Ahmed walked over to each man and thoroughly inspected their armor. He inspected the armor as closely as a mother hemming a wedding dress. "Is this the end?" Ahmed scoffed and said, "Death comes for us all. Life is only a meridian we travel, like the goat up a mountain trail. We walk from the bottom of the trail with hopes of reaching the top. We walk up the trail, but for how long we do not know. No matter how fast we walk, no matter how careful we walk, in the end, it doesn't matter. The path chooses us. We do not choose the path. The path chooses when our journey comes to an end." The men stoically glanced at their wise captain, the famous Ahmed Fahad. Ahmed took a moment to rejoice in the simplicity of the valley. Nasser's long wavy hair wafted in the wind as a strong gust blew through the valley. Ahmed bent down and purged a bundle of crabgrass from the ground. He raised up his hand and gently released the blades of grass. The razor-sharp grass was effortlessly carried away by the gust of wind. "We have the wind to our backs," Ahmed shouted to his men. "Someone must be looking out for us," Asad said. "How fortuitous," Abdul-Ahad said, while rubbing the soil of the valley in between his hands. "Rather auspicious, if you ask me," Nasser said. Ahmed smiled and said, "Destiny has brought us together to this one moment in time. Our fates have been intertwined. Facing down the barbarian horde of over 200 bloodthirsty Sassanians. We may be outnumbered, but I'd take 5 Afghans over 200 Sassanians any day of the week and twice on Sunday. When they approach the riverbed, I want you to hurl your spears high into the air. Then we charge." "Charge? You want to charge? That's your plan?" Abdul-Ahad asked his captain. Thump, thump, thump. Ahmed Fahad placed his hand behind his back and bathed his face in the warm embrace of the Afghan sunlight. He stretched his arms to the side and perched his palms onto the hilt of his sword. "If they see a smaller force charging at them, the wings might break rank and scatter. The Sassanians will attempt to surround us, but the valley will prevent any such formation. We charge, then fight backing up into the valley. The narrow paths, the wind, and rocky footing will be our advantage. Watch my back, watch each other, and God will watch over us all. On this day, our names will live forever." "It sounds crazy enough to work," Qassar said, holding back his stomach as he laughed out loud. "It can be done if God wills it," Nasser said to his comrades with an optimistic tone of voice. Asad stroked his beard and said, "On this day, we do the impossible. Why not?" "Ahmed Fahad, the famous," Abdul-Ahad said while clutching his hammer. Thump, thump, thump. The Sassanians marched over the mound of the valley in a tight formation. They hymned a chant as they marched and pounded on those dreaded war drums. Those same war drums that haunted the dreams of Abdul-Ahad. One row of Sassanians turned into three turned into 10. "Hoist our banners high, boys!" Ahmed shouted to his men. Qassar unraveled the makeshift banners and began to hoist them on long wooden spikes. Qassar walked over to each man and shoved the spike into their hands. One by one, the men hoisted their banners and slammed them into the mushy soil of the Panjshir Valley. The tattered black and crimson flags blew against the backs of the men, towards the direction of the oncoming Sassanian horde. "Are you really famous?" Abdul-Ahad asked his captain. Ahmed scoffed gleefully and said, "We are about to find out, Abdul-Ahad. We are about to find out." The Sassanians swelled in numbers as they approached the mouth of the valley. The valley was littered with natural impediments. Hundreds of jagged boulders were scattered around the valley. Rows of arborous species lined both sides of the valley. A riverbed fissured the valley into two distinct halves. One half of the valley was rocky. The other half of the valley had developed into a marshland. Thump, thump, thump. "Maybe they'll surrender," Nasser joked. Qassar grabbed his swollen stomach and bellowed over in laughter. His laugh carinated the belly of the valley, bouncing from one end to the other like the roar of a yodel. A hazy mist of salty air dampened the valley and muffled the sharpness of the laughter that blended with the gusts of wind. "Someday I will tell my grandkids the story." "When they reach the riverbed, we charge," Ahmed said while pulling out his sword. As the Sassanians drew closer, the thumping magnified. Ahmed raised his sword to the sky and screamed, "Charge!" The 5 men stormed down the trail, shrieking blood-curdling screams. The screams echoed throughout the valley like the wailing of banshees roaring out of the abyss. The Sassanians stubbornly slowed their descent on the mound. They approached the muddied ground of the riverbed with some noticeable trepidation for the terrain. The sound of the thumping was overwhelmed by the screams of the 5 men. The Sassanians fettered out into disjointed battle lines. The muddied riverbed pushed the Sassanian lines into more of a checkered pattern than a proper military formation. The battle lines moved lazily throughout the riverbed as the men approached from the other side of the valley. The 5 lions quickly closed the gap and leaped at the Sassanians before they could develop a properly arranged formation. Qassar leaped up first with his war club in both hands and slammed it down onto the nearest Sassanian. The Sassanian squandered any goodwill he had on that day by foolishly raising up his sword to block the war club. Qassar came down on the Sassanian and smashed the man's sword straight through his face. In the first volley, he split the man's head into 2 pieces, like a knife through melted butter. The Sassanian's body spasmed in place for a moment and fell to the ground with a loud thud. Blood squirted from the man's brainstem and gushed all over the front line of the Sassanians. Kassar swung his war club wildly. He whirled around with the devastation of a tornado. He pulverized the shields of the Sassanian front line, like the clobbering destruction of a wrecking ball against concrete. Asad swiftly notched 3 arrows to his bowstring and popped up in the air, shooting a volley into the back lines of the Sassanians. The Sassanians raised up their shields in a feeble attempt to block the oncoming strafe. The commander of the Sassanians rolled out of the way, successfully dodging one of the arrows, while one hit him in the left shoulder. The other stray arrow bounced off a shield and struck one of the Sassanians in the hamstring, instantly dropping the man to the ground. He writhed in pain as he attempted to pull the arrow out. The man dropped his shield, giving Asad just enough time to notch his bow with another arrow. Asad effortlessly drew back on the bow and unleashed a single arrow into the man's forehead. He smiled and ran off laterally down the riverbed to find some cover. Ahmed and Abdul-Ahad rushed into the center of the lines and clashed with the Sassanians. Some of the men instinctively scattered from their formation. The center began to buckle as Abdul-Ahad swung his blacksmith hammer in wild, swirling loops. Ahmed sliced up the front line of Sassanians, fighting 3 at a time. He leaped heroically back and forth as he jousted the Sassanians. He feinted flawlessly. He dodged attacks from every angle. He parried attacks 1 and 2 at a time. One of the Sassanians got lucky and was able to slice Ahmed's forearm just above the wrist. Abdul and Ahmed fought back to back, encircled by a dozen bloodthirsty Sassanians. They rushed in one by one, and the 2 men repelled the attacks with ease. Abdul-Ahad momentarily lost his footing and slipped into the muddied ground of the riverbed. 2 of the Sassanians jumped in to strike Abdul from behind. Abdul raised his arms to block the oncoming Sassanian swords. Whoosh! Out of nowhere, 2 knives flew in and struck each Sassanian in the heart. Their large bodies fell backwards onto the riverbed and splashed water across the battlefield. Nasser rushed in and slid over to his comrade in arms. In one swooping motion, he slid across the ground and plucked Abdul back to his feet. As Nasser popped up, he simultaneously pulled 2 daggers tucked into the back of his belt and spun around, throwing them in opposite directions. Both daggers hit a charging Sassanian and knocked them to the ground. Nasser reached down and snagged 2 of the daggers, 1 from each boot. As he stood up, a line of Sassanians replenished in front of the 3 men. Nasser, Abdul-Ahad, and Ahmed stood down 15 fresh Sassanians. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. 3 more arrows pelted the Sassanian lines, but only 2 of the arrows fired true and hit their intended targets. Asad leapt heroically into the fray with his comrades. The 4 men smiled at each other as they calmly walked toward the Sassanians and said simultaneously, "Even in death, we may live forever." As the men approached the front line of Sassanians, a large circular shadow dwarfed the men. They looked back up. Kassar had flung a massive boulder at the Sassanians. The boulder smashed through the front line and scattered the demoralized Sassanians. "Can't let you hog up all the glory," Kassar said while screaming at the top of his lungs. Kassar smiled down on his fellow Afghans. As he stepped forward, a spear hit him in the side. Kassar fell to his knees and turned his head towards the Sassanian spear chucker. "Kassar!" Nasser shouted to his injured comrade. The Sassanian instantly regretted his decision to step onto the field of battle, as Kassar's eyes glazed over with a blood rage. He snapped the spear like a twig and tossed it to the ground. Kassar took his war club and charged at the man. The Sassanian slipped and fell to the ground as he attempted to retreat into the forest. Kassar took his war club and flogged the young Sassanian warrior to death. As he slammed his war club down on the man, Kassar's face began to turn pale. He looked down at his wound. It was far worse than he initially thought. After pummeling the Sassanian into a pulverized mush, he kneeled over from exhaustion. Nasser broke off from his brethren and jolted towards his injured comrade. As Nasser ran to assist his comrade in arms, he took an arrow to the shoulder. The arrow lodged in between his deltoid and bicep. Blood oozed out of his shoulder and down his side. Nasser was running on pure adrenaline. It barely fazed him as he ran. Asad looked over to the group of archers lobbing arrows at Nasser and Qassar. He notched his bow and slowly drew back on the bow. His arm quivered as he steadied his aim. "Even in death, we may live forever," Asad said while steadily aiming his bow. He released the string of his bow and the arrow floated over the lines of the Sassanians, striking one of the other archers in the face. Asad lowered his bow and took a deep breath. One of the Sassanians snuck behind the men and slashed Asad in the back with a single silent strike. He flung his bow into the air and dropped to the ground. Abdul-Ahad turned his head to the sound of Asad screaming. He took his blacksmith hammer and wound it up behind him. He tossed the hammer at the Sassanian with all of his might. The force of the hammer crushed the facial bones of the Sassanian and snapped his head back, completely dislodging it from his spine. The man was dead, but his body did not yet realize it. His body quaked and fell to the ground, like a decapitated zombie. Abdul-Ahad spun around and plucked his hammer from the Sassanian's skull. "How bad is it?" "Be still, brother," he said while examining his comrade. As Abdul-Ahad examined Asad's back, another scream lashed out from the front lines. Ahmad was struck with 2 spears, one from the left and one from the right. He raised up his sword and slashed down the 2 Sassanians holding each of the spears. Nasser tossed the last of his knives and ran over to his mortally wounded captain. The Sassanians had almost scattered and taken cover behind their archers. Nasser snatched up Ahmad and stumbled back to Abdul-Ahad. "Are you really famous?" Asad asked his captain while coughing up blood. The blackened blood drenched the jaw of the Afghani archer. "We are all famous on this day. On this day our names shall live forever," he said while patting Asad on the shoulder. Blood rained from the ears of the captain and drooled from his eyelids. A volley of arrows launched at the men. In an instant, Ahmed looked up at the incoming arrows and began to scan his men. He looked down at Abdul-Ahad and with his last ounce of strength shoved him out of the way. The arrows, however, tattooed the men like chickenpox. Asad laid on the ground, completely motionless. Nasser took 3 arrows to his lower torso and reverse army crawled over to Ahmad. "Even in death, we may live forever," Nasser said while reaching out to his captain. He extended his hand to Ahmad, only for it to go completely limp. 6 lightly armored Sassanians witnessed the successful barrage of arrows and charged at the men with a renewed vigor. Ahmed rose up to his feet, with at least 6 gushing wounds on his body. He could barely bring his sword up to his waist. His legs wobbled uncontrollably as he prepared to put up his final fight. As the Sassanians came barreling down on the men, a large shadow covered the Sassanians from the side. Qassar had rose up from the grave like a zombie and charged the men with 2 battle axes. He swung like a whirlwind, furiously chopping down the Sassanians. In the process, the archers had tattooed his back with 12 arrows. Qassar dropped the axes and fell face first into the ground. Abdul-Ahad crawled over to defend his captain. His legs wobbled, scathed and beaten by the battle. Abdul-Ahad looked at his captain and said, "If this is our destiny, then we have lived a good life. It was an honor." Ahmed fell to one knee and plunged the tip of his sword in the ground. like an old man using a crutch to stand. Abdul-Ahad latched onto his captain and propped him upright. His chest caved over like a hunchback. "If we die, we shall die on our feet." "You fought well today, Abdul-Ahad. You fought like a true Afghan. Your father would be proud." "I had an excellent instructor." The two wounded men stood side by side as another swarm of Sassanians mounted an offensive. Abdul-Ahad held up his blacksmith hammer at the sky and started chanting an ancient hymn. As the Sassanians approached, the sweat from his hand began to drip down onto his forehead. The Sassanians lowered their advance, like the snow leopard stalking an unsuspecting elk. A mysterious treble quaked the ground, like the aftershock of an earthquake. Abdul-Ahad looked over his shoulder to the southern trail. A swarm of camels was riding down from the palace at breakneck speed. The camels rode past the two men with a furious intensity. The palace guard, led by the king of Afghanistan, cut down the remaining Sassanians with ignoble brutality. The eager novices shouted and hollered as they swept up the rest of the Sassanian forces. The king swung his sword with gleeful admiration for the blood sport, splashing Sassanian blood with every swipe. Dust swarmed around the two men, acting as a natural cover from the Sassanian archers. The king shouted at the guardsmen to press the attack against the fleeing Sassanians. After consuming enough spectacle for a lifetime, the king rode his camel over to Abdul-Ahad and his wounded captain. He leapt down from his camel and began to wipe the blood from his blade. He sheathed his sword and said, "What kind of king would I be if I was unwilling to defend my own kingdom?"